Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Welcome, Tony Beadle, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you, Marcia. Great to be here tonight with you.
It's great to have you, and I'm very interested in getting into the conversation about your specific topic. But before we do, I always like to have my guest introduce themselves a little bit, sort of give a little thumbnail about who they are and how they got to where they are now.
Sure. I was born of a Catholic priest out of wedlock, and we'll go down this road a little bit more later in the interview. But mostly, I had a very happy childhood, and I was in a musical home. My mother was a piano teacher, and my father could play piano. And I took up the piano myself for a while and then switched to, of all things, the double bass, the big violin that is played like this. And I stayed with that for a number of years. I went to Boston University School of Music as a double bass major and then found myself being in demand around Boston, playing ballet, opera, Broadway shows, and subbing at the Boston Symphony and Boston Pops. And I did that for a number of years. And then I decided to, as my musician friends say, I went to the dark side because I decided to go into arts management, managing such groups. And I've had a terrific ride for the rest of my career in that regard. And I worked at the New York Philharmonic, the Oregon Symphony, and my first real job full time was in Erie, Pennsylvania. And then I hopped back to Boston, where I became the manager of the Boston Pops for a number of years, and overseeing the recordings, the tours, all the concerts, July 4th, etc. So I retired about 3 years ago after doing a lot of that. I will say the last few years, I also opened and ran a performing arts center in Rockport, Massachusetts. It's called the Shallin Performance Center. And its unique aspect is that at the back wall of the stage, it's a concert hall, but the back wall from ceiling to floor is a picture window looking out directly to the ocean. So it has gotten some fame in that regard alone, but it's a favorite of a lot of the world's great musical artists. So that's been, my job and my life. And 2.5 years ago or so, I retired. And that's where I put my nose to the grindstone to write my book, My Father the Father.
So let's talk about your book,
Yeah.
Your Father the Father. What made you decide to quote unquote come out and talk about this story, which I suppose was shrouded in secrecy for many years?
Oh, definitely was. Actually, when I was working at the Boston Pop, so that would have been in the early 2000s, I came up with the idea of writing a book about it because I thought that the whole issue of celibacy was a bad path to be going down for the Catholic Church, as we all know. And my father, he was not celibate for sure, of course, but if you really measured the number of hours that he spent with me growing up, it's probably not much more than a businessman who's out on the road as salesman and everything like that. So he was taking care of his parish, which is about 15 miles down the road from where our home was. And he had that role, but then he had his other role as my father. And so he would be at my house 4 days a week, for 7 or 8 hours. And he would stay overnight. And they didn't tell me for a number of years until I figured it out that he was my father. But, he came on at my very young age that he was a friend of my father. And the lie is that my father asked him to take care of me because my father was going to die, et cetera, et cetera. So the lying was complex about that. And it didn't hold up as I got older because, I could put two and two together and figure it out. So
Yeah. How did you end up feeling about your father and your mother for, holding this big, huge secret all these years?
yeah, I may, whatever I had an anger or resentment, I did not feel was very strong. And I felt there was the opportunity for me was to exhibit forgiveness. And I thought when we first got together and they told me, it wasn't shocking new news. I put two and two together long before that. And I was resentful that they lied to me. And I thought about just leaving them. But, I thought at the time, two wrongs do not make a right. And what am I going to do? I'm just going to go somewhere and I'm going to be, probably after I think it over, I would regret my decision. So I had to exhibit forgiveness, and I'm glad I did. It was very good for me and good for them. So we remained close, like two parents and a kid, up until the day that my father died and then my mother died.
And did anyone else know about your father's secret?
Well, that's in the book. Nobody in my mother's circle knew about my father being my father, but he would be down at our house 3 or 4 times a week, with my mother. And my mother would introduce him. She would sort of screw it up. Some of the neighbors, she introduced him as her brother in law, and as others, as a friend of my father, and that sort of thing. Of course, the neighbors put two and two together, but they knew he was a priest. And so, he spent time, I'd say, 20 to 30 hours a week at my house. He would stay overnight, and yet he was still down the road in East Milton, where he had his parish, and he was fully engaged there. And he was also a fundraiser for the Archdiocese of Boston, and was a close friend of the cardinal at the time. Richard Cushing was his name. And so he raised a lot of money. He was very good at putting together big fundraising events. So he would do that as along with his parish. So
Like, did anyone else know what was going on? Like, did anyone
no,
from his
no,
parish?
no.
So, were you and your mother expected to keep this secret?
Yeah, it was a given. Yeah.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, I understand it because it was protecting the Catholic Church. That's all it came down to. And as a kid, I accepted it and everything. As an adult, I sort of accepted it, but I was sort of like, okay, whatever it takes. Your secret. I don't have to. I'm an adult. I'm not living at home. You do what you want. But then my father, he developed cancer, and it was going to be terminal. And they decided to set up his hospice for his last few weeks in the rectory, which is the residence of Catholic priests at his parish, next door to the church. And so he was there, getting weaker by the day. And I would go and see him every day. And there were two or three other priests living in the rectory in those at that time. So I told the number two priest who I was. And he said, I sort of figured that out, because every time you would come, he would have sort of an uplift in his energy as he continued to, get weaker and weaker. And so I asked the priest, well, as he was getting near to what was going to be, the end, I asked the priest if I could have a key to the rectory and I could just go in and see him at any time without bothering the priests and everything like that. And he said, sure. And this number two priest said, like whenever I'd come in there, it sort of lifted the energy for him and everything. So, um, and that was really hard for me. And then my mother stayed away from that whole scenario of when he was dying until the very end. And she saw him, at probably 2 days before he passed. And they went in, and she went in alone, and I didn't go in the room, but I was in the next room, and I could sort of see and hear them. And it was very, I guess you would say, intimate, the conversation they had and everything. So, but it all sums up to the fact, why are priests celibate? Why is the Catholic Church doing that to men when it doesn't add to any of their ability to function as a priest? So my father, I did the calculation of the hours at one time. I forget exactly what they are, but they're pretty much the same as if you were a traveling salesman. So he was at home and stayed overnight 4 days a week. And then the rest of the time, he would be at his parish in the mornings and that sort of thing. But he would come down in those afternoons, stay overnight, and go back the next morning. It was probably about a 20 or 25-minute drive. So he led two lives that way. And yet his job performance was not at all, weakened by the fact that he wasn't there at certain times and that at weekday afternoons and that sort of thing. So it was doable.
Well, obviously, it's doable because every other clergy person who is not celibate, all the Anglican priests and pastors and reverends and
Exactly.
rabbis and ministers, imams, none of them are celibate, and they're all functioning perfectly well in their jobs. So
Exactly.
every other religious leader of every other religion, except maybe some Buddhists, are not celibate and they're all fine, doing fine in their job.
That's right. They're fine.
So we
So,
have proof
yeah.
just by all the others.
Well, yeah. And I think, I'm sure somebody could correct me on this, but I think the whole idea of celibacy started was because in medieval times or at some period in history that the homes and the buildings that the priests lived in or utilized were their property and not the church's. So, therefore, if the priest had children, that property would pass on to the children as opposed to the church. And I think that's where they instituted celibacy. Certainly not in the New Testament.
Well, as usual, it's about money. But
Yes.
I know your book is about the idea of celibacy and this priesthood, but I keep coming back to this, you know, this choice that your parents made. I'm a psychiatrist, right? So I think about the psychological ramifications of things. And I think, your parents made a choice for themselves, but they didn't consider its effect on you. The
Right.
fact that you were so forgiving and so accepting and understanding is, it's great, but it could have been a completely different situation. You could have blown things up in their face. You could have been rebellious. You could have shown up at his parish, smoking a joint and screaming. Like, first of all, they were taking a risk for themselves, but they were also taking a risk in terms of how it would affect your own development and your own sense of self. Because, to grow up with a secret can often mean to grow up with a lot of shame, right? Because you're their secret. And
Hmm.
so they risked that. And the other thing is, there was an expectation that you kept their secret. And so they made you responsible for keeping a secret. They put a burden on you that you
Yeah.
didn't ask for, that you didn't choose. And again, you were okay with it, but a lot of people would not be. And I certainly
Yeah.
have seen similar scenarios that you're describing where a child was raised out of wedlock, as an illegitimate child, not necessarily by a priest, but by, a married man or something like that. And the child grew up with tremendous shame and tremendous sense of abandonment and a lot of confusion about their identity, and a lot of resentment and hurt and anger and mental health problems, ergo my patient. So the fact that you came out of it okay is, I think, kind of a fluke. But I'm sort of wondering about the choices that your parents made to do this thing and burden you with this secret and burden you with this identity and just kind of hope that it worked out because it's what they wanted.
Yes, your observations are spot on. Well, I think because my father remained hidden from like my mother's friends, so there's an element to that. He would come to the house in Hanover, Massachusetts, where I grew up, surreptitiously. So he would come in the afternoon, put his car in the garage, sneak into the house, and then have dinner, stay overnight, and then go back early in the morning. So he never interacted with maybe one or two exceptions where he would come down sort of in a little charade, come down on Thanksgiving afternoon and stay for Thanksgiving dinner and meet other people. But by and large, it was surreptitious. He came, snuck in, and he snuck out, and so all of those kinds of issues were not relevant. Nothing happened, or nobody was questioning. I think one or two of the neighbors may have, and my mother's solution to that was to tell them that he was a friend of my father's that promised to overlook and help to take care of me as a kid, and that sort of thing.
But for example, like sometimes there's, bring your father to school day,
Yeah.
or, what does your father do for a living in school day, And so, like, there were obviously going to be times when you would have to tell a lie about who your father was in order to protect him,
Right.
right? So a child should never be in a position of having to protect their parent from a secret that the parent chose to impose on the child.
Oh, but the realization that he was my father, and then to sort of confront them about that fact, I mean, I was afraid to do that because I didn't know if it was just going to blow up the whole life that we had or I had or love or anything. But, you know, like in the story she would hand off to the teachers and the parent teachers association, all that stuff, was that she was a widow, so therefore she could go to any school event or do anything. There was no father figure that was necessary because of what she was telling everybody. And those that saw my father, the neighbors, she introduced them, as I said, she would screw it up. To one, he was a friend of my father's, to another it was his brother, and
It sounds to me like she had some kind of unconscious desire to let slip the truth by
Yes.
messing up. But I want to go back to the thing you said about how you were afraid to confront them because you were afraid to blow it up. So that tells me that, you were under certain kinds of pressure because you had a fear of speaking the truth because you might lose something, right? You might blow up your own family if you actually told the truth and said, I know the truth.
But I would not have thought that at the time. It might have been
Yes.
subconscious that I was doing that.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
also thought that if it were to be, it was like this secret. If I were to blow it up, then I would have caused my mother and father to be angry or sad or just, that was more the operative feeling at that
Yeah.
time. But your point
Yeah.
is well taken.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's unfair of your parents.
Yeah.
It's selfish and unfair of them to put you in a position of having to keep a secret and not tell the truth because you're afraid of hurting them or upsetting them or jeopardizing the family dynamic. So
Right.
so they did this thing to you without considering the effect on you, and only because you're such a good person that they kind of got away with it without any consequences.
Right.
But you could have had quite serious consequences, and you were lucky you didn't. But I keep thinking, wow, so I'm actually surprised to hear you say what you're saying, because I was expecting you to say, those parents of mine. So it's kind of
No,
surprising.
no.
No, yeah, I know. It's kind of surprising to hear you sound, so at peace with it, because I really would not have expected that, because people with lesser kinds of secrets, this big, huge institution that your father had to protect,
Hmm.
would be much more upset about what was done to them.
Yeah.
To me, the parents should always be responsible for the children's needs and feelings as opposed to the other way around.
Right. Well, probably why that was not more pronounced than you might think is that, I was fed the lie that he was a friend of my father's and was going to take care of me because my father asked him to do that on his deathbed. And, as I got older, they never kept that story straight either. But, I think, I don't know what to say about that. I was never put off to the one side. I was not like the extra bundle of issues or something. And because of where I lived and my mother and where he lived, it was far enough away that there could never be, somebody saw it or saw them together or did something. In fact, whenever we did anything like to go out to dinner, we never did it around Hanover, Massachusetts, where I lived, or Milton, where he was. We go to Rhode Island. So, or near the border. And so there was that element too. Yeah.
And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. Since I was a kid, I've loved watching movies. As a psychiatrist, I'm blown away by how film touches us at our core, deepens our self-knowledge, and can improve the human condition. I wanted to let listeners know that I've started a new podcast called Real Mental with Dr. Marcia Sirota. I'm going to be talking with directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health on the big and small screen. Some recent films covered are Anora, Amelia Perez, Will and Harper, and The Last Showgirl. Please subscribe to Real Mental on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Sounds like you're just a very forgiving person, and your parents were very lucky that they were able to, carry on for all these years.
Well, yeah. I mean, it wasn't like I was treated badly either. I was treated like a prince. I mean, I wasn't spoiled, but anything that I wanted to do or thought about, they always supported me and they were proud of me. And, many times, like my father, if there was an event at school, like I graduated second in my high school class, and a big, what I forget what they call it, salutatorian or something at the graduation. My father snuck in the back and then snuck out before I could see him because I was on the stage, but nobody else saw him. So it's that kind of thing. I mean, I think my father didn't resent me. I mean, certainly I was a hindrance to his lifestyle, a freewheeling priest and all that stuff, but he lived up to it. I mean, I think his flaw was that he still put the church in the number one position. And, if he were to confess that he had a son and then resign, it would be a blot on the church's reputation. And I think that's what his opus, moverendi was operandi. So just to keep keep everything, calm and calm voyage and just go on with it. So
Did you have any pushback from the church when you published your book? Did you have any feedback from anyone in the church?
no, no, but that's funny you should ask because not a word, not a word. And I've gotten many contacts from people who knew my father when they were children. And without exception, they all say what a great priest he was and what a great human being he was. So, not news to me. Yes, you're right. However, somebody who lives close to my father's parish, and my father's parish was, there was a large church with a large congregation, then a school, and attached to the school was what they called a parish center, which was probably a gymnasium at one time. They turned it into some kind of function hall, and then the rectory. My father lived in the rectory. When my father retired from there, although he still lived there as a retired, but he wasn't the pastor of the whole place anymore. They named the parish center after him, so it was called the Monsignor Ralph Gallagher Parish Center. And they also, the city of Milton, Massachusetts, where the church was located, named this little sort of one of those traffic roundabouts that was right in front of his church. They put up a little sign naming that roundabout after him. So he had he had two name things going. And don't you know it? After my book came out and it got around, the church made it their business to tear his name off the parish center, and the town of Milton, took down the thing in the traffic circle. So, and my response was, well, how about Senator Kennedy, drowning a woman, and yet everything and his brother is named after him in Massachusetts, so it's kind of hypocrisy of another ilk, you might say. So, but it
Yeah,
is what it
yeah.
is.
So, what made you feel, since you don't have any resentment or anger or unfinished business, what made you decide that you were going to write a story since you had so successfully kept the secret all these years and been, very like agreeable? What made you decide to out your father at this point and your mother as well?
I just thought it was an interesting story and what humans do to compensate. So they compensated their lives and everything they do in order to keep the Catholic Church seem whole. And I thought that was a mistake, and that, my father should have just resigned. Yes, 5 minutes of humiliation, 5 minutes of scandal, and get on with it. But he couldn't do that because that power of the church and all the things that it requires and expectations that the church has for its clergy, he just couldn't do it. And, as a priest, he was very successful. He was a major fundraiser for the cardinal at the time and well known. And he was in charge of this moneymaker called the Boston Catholic Directory that was listed all the Catholic priests and where they were located in the archdiocese. But basically, it was, it's about an inch and a half thick of advertising, and that my father got the advertising. So, and he was a buddy of Richard Cardinal Cushing, who was a big deal in his time as well in Boston and beyond. And I don't think he could have faced Cushing with the truth either, because Cushing relied on him to raise money and that sort of thing. I've been in the business of being sort of a music entrepreneur, presenting concerts, and I've worked at the Boston Pops Orchestra as its manager and all kinds of places. And I get that from my father because he would put on all kinds of events and horse shows and plays and everything to raise money for the archdiocese. So it's in our DNA.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you say that your father was, so successful in the Catholic Church. Maybe he just wanted to have his cake and eat it.
Yes,
Maybe he wanted to keep his successful career and also have his family, right? He made a choice.
I think he did, but I think more moreover, I don't think he wanted to be a scandal, cause a scandal for the Catholic Church.
Did you ever ask him? Did you
No,
ever get a chance to ask him why he made the choices he did? That would have been an interesting question, eh?
I know, but I never did. And then, I probably didn't have the gumption to do it at the time. And then he passed away. So I
And
certainly,
your mom too. Yeah, your mom too. Like I'm thinking like what would have made her go along with this arrangement, right? Like, why did she say, okay, I can live like that? Because she didn't get to have a normal life as a woman, as a wife
No.
and a mom, right? She had to keep a secret. She had to tell stories. Her husband was her, not her husband, her partner was sneaking in and sneaking out. And she couldn't say that she was a married woman. So she didn't have the status. And she had to make all these pretenses and lies and missed out on a lot. Like she couldn't bring him to all the family gatherings. It's interesting, like, that she made her choice too, and why she made that choice.
Yes, and her in making that choice, she had this whole body of lies and sort of stories of what she was doing and where she was doing in order to deal with her own family. So she had a sister, she had nephews and nieces, and her parents were alive, at least when I was an infant. I think her mother died when I was about 7 or 8 years old, but I never met them. I never knew them. She'd talk about them, and she somehow intimated that they were all gone now or something. But they lived about, a 45-minute drive from Hanover, Massachusetts, where we lived, to Waltham, Massachusetts. And so she was lying to them, saying that she had moved to New York. And because remember, these are the days where you didn't have caller ID and all that kind of thing. She would call them up and say she's in New York and she's working for some company down there. And then she would, as I got older, I said, "Who the hell are you talking to?" And she said, "Oh, these are my close friends, and I'm going to go see them. They live in Waltham," which they did. "I'm going to go see them, and then I'll be back. And so you can stay." As I was older, so I could stay alone, or my father would come down. And that was her family, and they never knew about my existence until, it's very interesting. One of my cousins on that side, my mother and I was in probably ninth grade or something. No, later, it was older than that, because I was playing in an orchestra that was in Europe doing a tour as a student orchestra. And so my mother came over at the end of that, and then she wanted to go to Ireland. So we went to Ireland, and then she bought some kind of, Irish cloth she was going to send to her friends, as she always quoted them, in Waltham. And she sent it, and she said, here's the address. Will you fill out the thing for the customs and everything? And naively, I just put the address in Hanover, Massachusetts. They thought she was in New York. So they got the package with the Hanover return. And then my cousin, oldest cousin, she called my mother on it. And that sort of opened the door where I met my mother's family.
How old were you?
Oh, I was probably early 20s.
So you missed out on growing up with your cousins.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No cousins. So,
That's very sad.
yeah, it is. But
No
I
siblings, no
I
cousins.
have them now, though. So my cousins are, they're all great, and their kids are great and everything. So, it's worked out. But my father's family, after he died, I went to them. He had a brother and a sister, and his sister had two daughters. There may have been others, but I don't think so. And when I went to his brother and explained to him who I was, his brother's first statement, "Well, your mother was a whore." So that's a good way to start things off. And then his sister would have nothing to do with me, and her two daughters would have nothing to do with me either. So, c'est la vie.
Well, not c'est la vie. It's like this is what your parents, like this is the legacy they offered to you, right? They
Oh
offered you
yeah,
estrangement from your cousins
right.
till you were in your 20s, and then permanent estrangement from your father's whole entire
Yeah,
family.
that's right. But you can't miss what you never had. I don't lose sleep over that, and I know what my life is. And, I grew up as an only child. I met my cousins on my mother's side. We're close. And, I see my oldest cousin, she's very ill, and she's in basically not a hospice, but sort of a senior center with all kinds of medical things available. And I mean, I go over once, if not twice a week, just to see her, and that's how it is. I feel close to them, and vice versa. So I made up for lost time.
That's nice. That's
Yeah.
nice. Well, it's quite a fascinating story, isn't it? Like, we always think about the choices our parents make without thinking about maybe how it would affect us. And in your case, the choices they made were quite a doozy. And, I find it very interesting how, your mother's side of the family was quite welcoming and your father's side of the family quite the opposite.
Yes, that's right. Well, I think that it was the whole issue of, Catholicism and celibacy weighed heavily on them. Whereas, on the other side of it, yes, they expect Catholic priests to be celibate, but, there's no Catholic priest there in their family, but on the other side, he was the master.
Yeah, I suppose it would be very hard for them to see him as having fallen,
Yes,
and therefore they have to blame your mother and you.
that's right. That's exactly right. And his ego wouldn't allow that to have happened anyway. So, c'est la vie.
Mm,
But
amazing.
I have to say, I see my parents as weak, but I don't resent what they did. So, and that's
Yeah.
that's that's a good way to end it.
I mean, you don't want to be bitter and you don't want to be resentful, and you want to be able to be happy in your life, regardless of what choices your parents
That's
made
it. That's
ultimately.
exactly right. That's right. Yeah. I don't think about what my parents did or who they were, you know. So it is what it is. And I can only say that because they still loved me, as parents. They didn't put me in harm's way. They didn't say things to me or, they supported me, anything that I was interested in and wanted to do, they would encourage me. I mean, they were great parents. So
Other than that little secret you had to keep.
other than
Yeah.
that little secret, yes.
That tiny, tiny little
A
secret you
mere
had to keep.
bagatelle, right?
Right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me
Oh,
today. It's been really interesting. And I wanted to ask you my three final questions.
yes. Well, and thank you for having me on your podcast here. Thanks.
Oh,
I appreciate
pleasure,
it deeply.
pleasure, a pleasure. So the first question is, where can people find you if they're interested in learning about you or your book?
Well, the book is available in all the regular booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can order it from a bookstore too, I'm told. And, it's available. And, what I found, one interesting thing, you probably know this about books these days, is that they don't print 5,000 of them and have them in a warehouse. They print on demand. So when you go to Amazon, they're just printing your copy. So they do it quickly and it goes out the door quickly too. So that's the best bet, is to go there, or Barnes and Noble. I'm not sure too many people use that to buy books, but it's there, I'm told, as well. And there is a website there called myfatherthefather.com that the publisher put up, and you can sign up and do this, that, and other. And it's on the book, the URL, but nobody's really signed up for it at all. So, it's all redundant, really. But the book is available everywhere. So,
And are you working on any other books at this time?
well, it's funny you should ask. I'm sort of in this big list of things that I would like to write about because I enjoyed the writing and I enjoyed the amazing thing, I have to say, so many people have said how well written they think it is. And I have to say honestly that while I had an editor that read it at the very end, and that the publisher did what's called a line edit, where they look for typos and that sort of thing. But the editor that I had at the end, she says, I don't think you should touch anything. She said, I suggest you move a couple of paragraphs here and there because of the way the timeline flows. But she said, you're a good writer. And that's what people come back saying to me all the time. I don't mean to boast, but it's shocking. I thought it would be okay, but people read it to each other in cars. I mean, people have, they've told me about that, and they can reach me. I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook. So if people want to leave anything or want anything, but the best way to get it is Amazon.
Good. And my final question to you today,
Yeah,
Tony, is what is your call to action for the listener apropos of our conversation today?
call to the listener.
Call to action. Yeah.
Call to action. Well, I would say that if you're raised in a home of honest and open love, you should be very grateful for that. I had love at home, but it wasn't exactly honest or always open. And, that made me who I am, perhaps for the better or not for the better. But I think that if I could do it again, that's what I would like to have.
Well, maybe the next go around, eh?
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Tony Beadle, for coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me to do this. I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts, And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasarotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests, so please email us at info@marciasarotamd.com.